Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from the second chapter in Paul's epistle to the Philippians. We made it from verses 12 all the way to the end, verses 30. We're going to cover the 11 which come before that. But before that, we want to connect it to what we read in the first chapter. And what we read in the second chapter is that the Messiah, who is our exemplar and our model, was obedient unto death all the way onto the cross. And if he was willing to give his life for us, that means we who call his disciples, we have no right for him not to demand just as much. And no one struggles with, very few of us struggle with the question of whether we are willing to live by these principles, but are we willing to die for them? And Paul certainly was, and we get his insight and his mind set about the relative merits of life and death. His intense longing was now he's before the 20th verse, he's mentioning the multiplicity of motives according to which the Messiah is preached. And, some people preach for selfish gain, but he didn't care because the message was being spread one way or the other. So he was indifferent to the motive or the means. He was concerned with the end result. And his longing desire was to be made great in my body, whether by life or death. So life and death are the two comparisons and contrasts. And what he says in the 21st chapter, this verse, this is an easily memorable phrase: "For to me to live is Messiah, and to die is gain." So he lives, his every breath, his every step is oriented and geared towards the Messiah. And when he dies, he's going to consider that a gain because he will be closer to him than he is now in his present condition. But while he's got life on this earth and in the world, but not of it, he's going to spread the kingdom where he can. He's going to be his vessel and his obedient soldier all the way to the end of the earth. He is marching himself. He is in prison in Rome in 62 AD when he was writing this, and he was willing to suffer for the faith that he was also willing to die for. We all know he lived for it, but he also suffered greatly for it, and he was willing to die for it, and he ultimately did. So he got his wish, but as we read eventually, he knows that it is, but we'll read, "And if to live in the flesh is to me a fruit of work, then what shall I choose? I do not know. For I am pressed down by the two, having desire to depart and be with Messiah, which is much better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake." So Paul's chief concern wasn't Paul. He speaks against the selfishness and conceit in the third chapter of the third verse of the chapter we're going to be covering today. So his mind was geared towards others and above him, those around him and him above him. And he was a willing vessel he submitted. He had the mindset of a servant, a slave, and a soldier. So he had that total submission. And the 29th verse is the one we want to read before we get to the lesson itself. "Because to you it has been given as a grace on behalf of Messiah, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake." So the disciple not only believes in the Messiah, anyone can believe, any fair-weather disciple can believe, but how many of us are willing to suffer? And the suffering comes in many forms, but he is our great heavenly comfort, and he is always with us if we suffer for his name and we are connected to the fellowship of the suffering, of which he speaks of in the 10th verse of the third chapter. But for now, we just want to bear those two things in mind. His lack of selfish motive, he calls for the same thing out, and the exemplary model, the Messiah, who was obedient unto death all the way onto the cross. And if there was a cross in his life, that means there's going to be a cross in your life if you sign up. So count the cost before you go. But if you made it this far, you may as well get going. This is the lesson itself, second chapter of Philippians. "If then there is any encouragement in Messiah, if any comfort in love, and any fellowship or spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, having the same love, one in being and of purpose." So there's two figures mentioned in that. There is the Messiah and there's the Spirit. These are two divine beings, and to exist in relationship with them is the key which unlocks. Religion is not the essence of spirituality. It is about a relationship, and Elohim himself is a relational being. He exists in himself, 3 in 1. Yahweh Father, Yahshua Son, Ruach Kadesh, sacred spirit, and these are the ones who emanate love and affection and mercy and joy and all of the list above. So they are the key which unlocks these secrets which can be shared with others. Now the goal of being a collective congregational in his name and for his cause and for his sake is to be unity. So he wants them to not to be intellectually undiverse, but to really, have the same goals in mind. They don't have to agree on everything, every doctrine. There is room for disagreements, no room for error, but the Philippian assembly wasn't plagued by error. He did have some trouble there in the 16th chapter in Acts when he evangelized it through a woman named Lydia. And then he finds himself with Barnabas or Silas, his traveling companion, second missionary journey, and they sing in prison, and the walls come crumbling down, and they convert the jailer, but they were, between them, they had the same love. Paul and his missionary companion, Silas and Barnabas, they had the same mind, same love, same soul, and same purpose. So he provided a model in himself, but he's ultimately alluding to the ultimate model, who is to be our motivating propeller. Doing not through selfishness or self-conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. So selfishness taints any act of selflessness. As a church, we exist to do selfless deeds. We are not self-serving creatures or self-conceited or individually arrogant or prideful people. But the element of selfishness can corrupt and can contaminate and can spread like yeast in any congregation, fellowship, or assembly. But humility is what we want to cultivate when we are walking the same path with others. And we want to consider others better than yourselves. And this ties into Romans 12:3, where we read of the true definition of humility. Humility is not to have a degraded estimation of yourself. It is to have an accurate assessment. And to paraphrase the principle, if not the passage of Romans 12:3, it is dangerous to think of yourself more highly than you ought, but it is equally dangerous to think of yourself less than God does. Each one should look out not only for his own interests, but also the interest of others. So if we exist in fellowship, it's not all about us. We are a collective. We are a collective of individuals. Ergo, any individual's preeminence cannot supersede that of any other. And the way we do this is to not be mindful. We're not watching store. We're not watching our own shop. We're thinking about what we can share rather than what we can hoard in the earth. And so we were self-oriented creatures. Now we're geared to a collective, and other Christians are necessary. So the Christian life is not a solitary life. We have to exist in community. And even though I think some of the most valuable moments in my walk with God have come when I've been alone with him, I also know that he cannot exist apart from a community of like-minded believers. So the Christian life is not meant to be a lonely path, and since we are not on a lonely path, we cannot be self-oriented or selfish or self-motivated or self-conceited, or just any element of self must cease to exist in the born-again collective experience. Identity is an illusion. You are not your own. Your body was bought with a price, and it belongs to the one who paid the price to buy your salvation and redeem you. And for let this mind be in you, which was also in Messiah Yahshua. So as disciples, he is our master, he is our model, he is our prototype, and he is the first fruit of the resurrection. One of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing is to share the resurrection through the first fruit of the resurrection, but we have to align our minds with his. We have to value the same thing he does, be working for the same cause, the same kingdom. And we have to have the mindset which was revealed through his suffering and sacrifice in his walk. Who being the form of Elohim did not regard Elohim with Elohim, a matter to be grasped. So verses 6 through 9 or 6 through 11 was not, it was a famous Christian hymn that Paul was canonizing, and the words might be slightly his own, but it is based on a hymn, of an incarnational hymn, so that is his primary source of information. But Paul obviously had more advanced knowledge of the mysteries of the New Covenant than the average singing congregant in the New Testament assembly. But he was in the form of Elohim. That means he was Elohim. He literally was Elohim. He was with him from the beginning, and he was equal in essence to him, and he was equal. He could have claimed equality with him and been on, but he chose to make himself functionally subordinate to the Father. So even though the Father and the Son are equal in essence and equal, they are not equal in attributes. The Son is not, for an example, an omnipresent being. He was encased in flesh, and as such subject to the laws of physics and space and the limitations of being in the flesh that entails. He was also not omniscient. He knew not the hour of his own return, Matthew 24:36, and he is not omnipotent. You put nails in his hands, he's going to bleed, and he did die a human death, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and came to be in the likeness of men. So he voluntarily surrendered and sacrificed the full exercise of his divine attributes. He emptied himself voluntarily. He is a creature with agency. He is completely sovereign, yet he is submitted to the sovereign purposes of the senior partner in their relationship. And he came as a servant, and he embodied the paradox of servant leadership that we who call his disciples are to reflect and embody. And he came as a literal man, so he wasn't like a man. He was a man himself. He was divinity and flesh united in one and the same. And having been found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, death even of a cross. So we have a God complex within us. Within each and every one of us is a desire to aspire above and beyond ourselves, to make our own rules, be our own master, be the end-all, be-all in our own private universes. But the remarkable thing about him is he has a human complex. He condescended in the positive theological sense of the term. So when we speak of condescension in human terms, we think of someone who looks down their nose, but in the theological term, it means he came down from heaven, and that is an act of supreme humility. He humbled himself, and he was obedient all the way unto death. He prayed. He was a creature of flesh, and his flesh groaned in agony for what awaited him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Yet he struggled. He reconciled himself. If there was any other way, let this cup pass from me. If there was any other way that human beings could be saved and reconciled and restored with you, let it come to pass. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thy will be done. And the death was on the cross. This is the most excruciating physical pain imaginable, but the greatest, most poignant and painful aspect of it all was not the physical pain, but the spiritual suffering. When he became sin, the Father looked away from him, and he echoed the words of David, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" Yahweh therefore has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. So we witness the paradox. Because he humbled himself, he is exalted and esteemed to a name before which and besides which that no other name can compare. His name is a capital, and so every other name is a lowercase n. That means human or inferior. The superior is indicated in the capital letter name. So his name is a sacred name. His name has power, and strictly speaking, there is no separation between Elohim and his name, whatever it might be. They are one and the same in the Hebrew mindset. That at the name of Yahshua, every knee should bow, of those in the heavens, and of those of the earth, and of those under the earth. So everyone, everywhere is going to bow their knee on that day. They're going to be forced to, because the name is so great now. If we confess the name now, we are investing wisely in eternity, because it demands more than a confession of name, though. This is not to get by with doing the bare minimum, because what do we read in the Sermon on the Mount? Many of those who said, "Master, Master, I preached and prophesied and performed exorcisms, every other miracle," and he's going to tell them, "Depart from me, ye who do iniquity." So the key here is the voluntary bow of the knee. So he was voluntarily emptied himself. We must decrease in order that he may decrease in us. And the jingle, man is never so tall when he is on his knees when they are a Christian. So if we are humbled, he will be exalted. This is the juxta of the passage of Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, and 18:14. And he is certainly the full spectrum of that principle of he who humbles himself shall be exalted. He exalted above every name which has ever existed. Everyone under the earth, over it, and on it will bow compulsory in the day that he reveals his full splendor. And every tongue should confess that Yahshua Messiah is master to the esteem of Yahweh the Father. So everyone's going to know, even the unbelievers, the naysayers, the doubters, they're going to have no choice to reconcile themselves with the fact that they have been wrong when he reveals himself, when we must stand before him and be reckoned and be judged. So the key is to confession and knee. It's more than a mere motion. It is a spirit. You have to be in the spirit of doing it in order to do it correctly. And our words have to match our heart. So it is possible to say, I love Jesus. Everyone says that. He loves me too. But do they really love them? And, that's no two cases are exactly alike. But the one person we need to focus on is the saint in the mirror, because we don't want to lose our salvation by being wrapped up in the salvations of others, although that is certainly the goal. We are to be disciples who are making disciples. So I hope that you're here. The reason that you're here, I know that's the reason I'm here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.